Okay, sword dude and dudettes, we have a fun one today. This is a sword that's been lent to me very kindly by my buddies over at Unsheathed Sword Review. So this sword belonged to Vic and John, and they have been very patient since I've been very slow at getting to this sword, which has been part of our prisoner exchange program. So I've sent them some swords, and they've sent me some swords, and it's been taking a while. So I'm long overdue for doing a review for this one. This is going to be an informal review because I don't have all of the parts of this sword. This sword was sent without a scabbard. But I specifically asked the chance to be able to review this sword because it's been on my wish list for quite a while. What sword is this? This is the Balaur Arms 15th century Italian longsword, and it has long, for many years, topped the list of one of the best types of budget longswords on the market. It's very hard to find a longsword for, let's say, under $500 that is both, looks good and is accurate. Hi, Bunny. There's a bunny rabbit who's just hopping around, causing some ruckus. And the Balaur Arms line has gone through several different manufacturers, but across, and some models are better than other models, but the Italian longsword in particular has always been touted as one of their superior models. So this is one of the latest iterations of it, and I'm going to recommend you check out my buddy Alientude, as well as those made by the guys at Unsheathed Sword Reviews, since they go into greater detail talking about some of the earlier iterations of it. This is one of the most recent versions made by LK Chen, and I have other versions of, or rather other Balaur Arms swords made by LK Chen, so I have a pretty good idea of what, for instance, the scabbard would be like. For instance, on my Knights Templar sword from Balaur Arms, it's quite nice, so I could probably very confidently say that on the whole, if we want to skip to the end, this is going to be a very good and very nice sword. So we have a sword that has a quite long blade, so it's almost 90 centimeters, it's about 88 centimeters in blade length, and it has a pretty long grip. So this is very closely modeled off of a very famous longsword in Brescia, Italy. It has the characteristic hilt of the sword of Brescia, but it has a different type of blade, so we're going to come back to that. Most famously, the sword that is modeled off of that is the Brescia Spadona from Albion. Now, it varies from that sword a little bit. For instance, I'm not especially happy with the style of peen that they chose to add to it, and the type of blade that they put on it we'll talk about a little bit. So I'm giving it like maybe a B as far as the historicity is concerned. But as far as this execution is done, I am pretty happy, especially considering that this is a sub $500 sword at the time of this filming. The cross is very well done with all of the geometry, the way that it slots the blade into the shoulders of the cross, the type of riser that again follows the original Italian example, the very distinct kind of faceted scent stopper pommel that we have here on the end. Nothing is particularly sharp. Some makers have the finish on the product being a little too sharp to the touch. None of that seems to be apparent here. And it feels very nice in the hand. It has a particularly long grip on it. This is the type of grip that we have almost consistent with what you find on fetters. Recently, I had a couple of videos, one talking about how original longswords often have kind of short grips on them, longer than an arming sword, but oftentimes you're holding the pommel inside of the grip, and another video discussing how hand and a half or longswords could be used in one hand. This is kind of the combination of those two. It has a longer grip than usual, and it's even nimbler in the hand than many of the hand and a half swords that we'd expect to see. Whereas many hand and a half swords, original hand and a half swords, balance between 10 and 15 centimeters from the guard, this one balances at about 7.5 or 8 centimeters from the guard. It's within historic ranges, but it is quite nimble in the hand. Another interesting thing about it are where the pivot points are. The pivot points are, the aft pivot point is around here, but the forward pivot point is actually slightly past the tip. That means that if you're controlling the sword from the back, for instance, if you bind up against a longsword and you want to swing it around, you could very easily pivot the sword around an opponent's blade or polearm. But if you want to keep the tip on line against your opponent and you're controlling it from the forward pivot point, the tip tends to hover in one position, and it's very easy to keep the tip of the sword right where you want, locked on target, and it just kind of almost hovers there. So this is what I would call a fencing style longsword. This is not a longsword meant for war, just based on the balance of it. And it's very light. It's easy enough to use in one hand, aside from the fact that it's so long that you might bang into your wrist depending on some motions. Otherwise, it feels almost like having an arming sword in one hand. But it's got this nice big heavy cross. Anyone who practices longsword fencing will probably be very happy just with wielding this sword. What about the blade on it? So the blade on it has a diamond cross section. So that immediately tells us it's probably going to belong to one of two families, either an Oakshot type 15 family or an Oakshot type 18 family. If it was a type 15, you'd expect it to taper basically straight down to a point, basically some form of triangle, whereas type 18s tend to bow out slightly. This one does bow out slightly, but the manner of the taper with the ogive curve here at the end, that tends to look very much like you'd see a sword executed in China, which isn't surprising since this is a Chinese example. So I'd say that this is vaguely type 18, but it's not the most traditional version of a type 18 sword that I've seen. It also isn't quite as robust as many type 18 swords are. It's probably still within historic norms, but it has a decent degree of flex. It flexes in the right spot, but this particular example probably only has around 10 kilograms of flex in the blade. It's not whippy, but it's not the stiffest blade. And again, there's a spectrum. Some blades are quite flexible in the type 18 family, and others are quite a bit stiffer and quite a bit more suited for the thrust. So, shall we see how it performs? Pretty easy. What about one-handed? Went through the hardest part of the cap, and that's a recipe for injuring swords. Sorry about that, Vic and John, but fortunately, this is a very durable sword made by LK Chen and is showing no signs of injury. What about a slightly thicker target? No problem at all. So what you have in the Balaur Arms type or 15th century Italian longsword is a budget longsword that functions wonderfully in a hand and is just a pleasure to swing around. It is very close to many originals. It takes cues from originals for sure. So I would describe this as historically inspired, not a reproduction per se, but very close to originals, and it certainly handles much closer to long swords than you would usually expect to find from most swords in this price point. Because of the edge and because of the geometry on there, it's going to cut much better than many budget range long swords. Again, swords from other makers will usually have steep secondary bevels on them that make it very difficult, and if you're trying to sharpen the swords, you're going to have compromises. It's going to be very difficult, especially on such a long blade, and that's just a lot to ask for customers to have to deal with. So I can heartily endorse this one. Check it out. Thank you guys so much for letting me have the chance to review this one. This is a lot of fun, and we're going to take a look at some of the other swords lent to me by the guys in the upcoming videos. Till next time, guys, take care.